Welcome, everyone. My name is Monica Ariño. I'm the Director for International Affairs at Ofcom, the UK Media and Communications Regulator. I'm delighted to be chairing this net neutrality breakout session. We have a fantastic lineup, and I'm sure, despite the fact that this is the last session of the day, we will have a very lively discussion. Each of the panelists will speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for debate. We're going to start with Professor Chris Yu. He's our first speaker. I think he hardly needs any introduction. He's a professor of law and communication and computer and information science at the University of Pennsylvania. On the website, you can have access to his extensive biography and various achievements. Something that you might not know, because I asked each of the panelists to give me a little fun fact about themselves, is that Professor Yu, when he was younger, was the lead singer in 2 rock bands. So there you go. Chris has been following the net neutrality debate for a long, long time now, and what I wanted to ask you first is what's your take on how the debate has evolved, and where are we today? And most importantly, what does that mean for consumers?
Well, thank you very much. I'm only grateful that I did sing in 2 rock bands in the pre-YouTube era. So there is no lingering paper trail, although my brother keeps threatening to post things and I keep having to bribe him in different ways not to do that. Several people before this panel have mentioned to me that they've heard me talk about this for a long time, and I actually realized that for better or for worse, I wrote the second article on network neutrality. So Tim Wu wrote it his first one in 2003. I was asked to write a response in the same journal at the same conference the following year, and he wrote a rebuttal to my response. And so I realized that was in 2004, so I've been doing this a very long time and predicting the end of this debate for a very long time and been consistently wrong. I take some responsibility for getting it started. I take no responsibility for keeping it going as long as it has. But what's interesting is it feels like we've been talking about the same thing for a long time. And the panelists asked me to do, and I agree that I'm not going to talk about the details of the US order. Because if you're a US policy person, you already know all the details. And if you're not a US policy person, you don't want to know the details. We need to get this framed around the bigger issues. So what would I say is what people think of as one debate actually has not been one debate. When this thing first really emerged in 2004, 2005, it was primarily about non-blocking. And then, in a series of speeches by Michael Copps, Commissioner Michael Copps of the FCC, he introduced into the debate the idea of non-discrimination in 2007 as thinking that non-blocking wasn't sufficient. That was eventually put into the order in 2010. That was eventually struck down in 2014. And then in 2015, we shifted from what was previously a regime of ex post adjudication into ex ante rules. But even more importantly, in 2015, interconnection was added to the debate. And this is not anything we've talked about before and is more or less unprecedented in the debate. And so people who feel like this is old and familiar and we're having the same arguments really should look more closely at this, because what we've seen is a moving target that's actually expanded and changed the scope of what has been going on. And there's another issue that happened in the US is about whether you fold the internet back into the regime originally, the regulatory regime created for telephones. So what's interesting to me is other things that people I've seen written in the press is there is an emerging international consensus. There may be on certain issues, but in the broader, more important issues, I think there's still much that's greatly contested. So one of the big questions is, first, is the shift between ex ante and ex post rules. Very much up in the air about what the right mode is. I'm happy to have some conversations about what that is, because there are some legal scholarship that talks about when you use the different modes that I think we're not done for this context, but will give us some insight into it. More importantly, there's a big fight. What we've seen is the legislation in Europe has been hung up by a very sharp division between the Council, the Parliament, and the Commission. And one of the primary hang-ups is over what we call specialized services. These are typically application-specific, dedicated bandwidth to do voice. So if you have an LTE phone, it does not do voice over the top. VoLTE, you can do VoIP, but we all know the quality of that's quite uncertain. VoLTE uses dedicated bandwidth. And that is what essentially we would call a specialized service. If you've had an Amazon Kindle e-reader which got dedicated bandwidth to feed you books, that's a specialized service. Many of video services are done through specialized services. And so the scope of that and the concerns that too big an expansion of specialized services would then essentially take up all the bandwidth in the internet so that the internet really doesn't exist is a vital question, largely kicked down the road by the FCC in the US and very, very much a point of contention in the EU about how that's going to be defined. And so the other thing I would say is there is no consensus about interconnection. This is something we've just come on new in the issues. It's one that, and frankly, when I talk to regulators from other countries, really hasn't been a subject of study for them at all. And this is an area where I would say that we are just at the beginning of a conversation because that is potentially very, very sweeping and very important. The other thing about the shift in the debate from blocking to non-discrimination to interconnection should remind us that regulators face a very complicated task in a world that's rarely interconnected. Is that if you simply stopped blocking, or even better, if you stopped interconnection, discrimination, they can simply charge you different amounts for interconnection. And what you see is a moving target constantly moving around. But what the warning sign is even if you create an interconnection regime, which is going to be very difficult to do for any one regulator because many of the interconnections are global and they lack jurisdiction. Also, it is a network played of 40,000 networks bargaining independently through arm's-length transactions. So the idea that two similarly situated packets would pay the same end-to-end when you don't even know who the downstream partners are is very, very hard to see. But if you only regulated part of the network, that is the prices on one part of the network, and you get a price wrong, you're going to have an enormous problem of either data flowing away from it because you set the price too high, or even worse, data flooding into that connection if you set the price too low, and the normal accommodations we make get much more complicated. I'll make it even worse. The big dispute over interconnection happened between Netflix and Comcast, and one of the points that was made in the debate is there are 50 peering connections into Comcast. So even if one peering connection breaks down, people who want to continue to get it on a peering basis have 49 other alternatives and 8,000 transit relationships. In a world where traffic can flow and ebb in a very dynamic way, so to think about regulating un-interconnection connection in a vacuum doesn't really appreciate the way networks dynamics work. MIT was doing a study at the time this dispute went on, and they found that day by day, among the 3 transit connections between Comcast and Netflix, it was congested on one for one day, and then the next week was another, and the next week was another. And the strong suspicion is that there's traffic being shifted by an actor. It's not clear whether it was Cogent or Netflix or one of them. But one of the points I'm saying is that it's a very complicated thing, but the regulatory intervention on one interconnection link is not the end of the game because there will be dominoes and consequences that continue to follow that make this a very complex world. The other thing is traffic is growing. OTT video in the US, 2 providers represent 50% of primetime bandwidth. Netflix is roughly a third, YouTube is the remaining, it's 6, so between the 2 connections, it's half. And this is really revolutionizing the way that we're having to regulate these networks. And what's interesting is I gave a presentation similar to this in Korea just a month ago, and I got a number of questions, which is, what is Netflix? It's very clear to me it hasn't come everywhere. OTT video is coming, and I told them, you don't know what it is yet, but you will. It's one of these things where you see something growing at very, very large rates is going to transform the way we have to manage things. Plus, this now puts us in the tension between legacy regulation of video and often a different regulatory body for the countries that don't have converged regulators. And so this is going to be an extraordinarily complex set of problems that if we open them up, it's going to be difficult. I'll close by making a couple observations about something I find disappointing about the current debate. The first is I think that we've lost focus on consumers. Is that, in fact, what you often hear people is advancing positions about what's good for a company. And in a sense, when it's a commercial bargain, one company always wants to pay less, and the other company wants to get paid more. And for a regulator to get into this and to believe that someone feels like the price they're being charged is extremely unfair, it's going to be a tough dispute to adjudicate. And even if you set up a regulatory regime that tends to favor one side or the other, you should expect whichever side you've got it leaning towards to bargain so it looks like they're bargaining in good faith, but then resort back to the regulatory solution because that's their fallback position. They won't do any worse than that. And so what I found is that the prospect of having that sort of intervention over true arm's length negotiations can be really, really damaging. And what's interesting is you will even see deadlock. That's how I bought my house. The person I made an offer, she said, I need more money. I raised my price once. She said, I need more money. I said, I've bid against myself twice. If you're serious, make me a counteroffer and we'll have a real, I don't think you're interested in selling. I walked away from the deal. 2 weeks she called me back and says, will you buy the house? I'll sell it to you at your price. I wasn't playing games. We just had a disagreement as to the value. One of us found out we were wrong. And that's a normal part of arm's length bargaining. And we have to be patient. We have to realize that. And the fact that someone is frustrated or discovers they can't make a business model go is natural. The other thing that I would say is in this space is that traditionally economists have a blind spot. They always focus on price. And everything is about price and quantity, and they think about it that way. And they have a tendency to ignore variety. That there is a value, and there's actually a very different economics I've written on that looks at that, but conventional economics has a hard time taking that into account. On the other hand, I think that the people who are in favor of network neutrality often focus on variety to the complete exclusion of price and investment incentives. And like any good policy issue, the truth probably lies somewhere in between. When I see an app that's now 1/3 of the internet and continuing to grow, I understand they would love to terminate their traffic for nothing, but we're going to have to expand the connections they use to reach their end user. Someone's going to have to pay for that. Netflix would rather it all be borne by Comcast. Comcast would rather it all be borne by Netflix. If they're both receiving value, the real answer to me is they both probably should contribute to it because they're both responsible for it, and I think that that's a real issue. And in the end, all the value comes out of the consumers. So from a consumer standpoint, it's not really, is the consumer going to pay? All of that's coming, whether it's a direct payment to Comcast only, or Comcast and another payment to Netflix for the subscription, or for other models, an indirect payment to advertisers and through the purchase, the goods we buy. I don't think the structure of the payment is a policy issue. I think what we really should think about is finding ways to build the networks we need to deliver the services that are emerging now. And my guess is that all parts of the industry who benefit from it are going to bear some of that. And finding out the right way to divide that up is an interesting question. I think that our traditional answer has been through negotiations, and that's been a pretty robust one.
Thank you, Chris, for that. I'm going to turn to Prakash, who's a policy director and co-founder of the Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore. Last year, Forbes India selected him as one of his 30 under 30s list of young achievers. But the fun fact about him is not that, which is, it's a great achievement, but less fun. Pranesh is obsessive, and he's particularly keen on music, jazz and blues, and he has 180 covers of St. James Infirmary. With that introduction and picking up on the consumer point that Chris just made, as a consumer activist, do you agree with Chris's assessment? And what do you think that consumers need and want? And if you can give us the perspective of what's happening in India, which I think is quite a lot at the moment, that would be very interesting, I think, for this audience.
Sure. First answering the question of whether I agree with Chris, with what he said.
I actually go by Christopher. My wife is
Christopher. Oh, I'm so sorry.
I'm trying to make the change.
And with Professor Yu, is that with what he said today, I largely agree. But I have had a chance to read some at least of his voluminous writings on this issue, and I don't agree with all of it, especially with where he thinks the current levels of competition are, for instance, in the US, etc. But his policy prescriptions as to what we should be looking at are things that I largely agree with. So I am here presenting the consumer perspective on this issue. That is true. But I'd like to point out that just as consumers are harmed by under-regulation by the government, they are equally harmed by lack of competition. They're equally harmed by over-regulation, by restrictions on innovation that are put on companies, etc. Given this, it's not regulation that's either the enemy or the savior, but the real issue is how do we have good regulation? How do we prevent over-regulation in the name of good regulation, et cetera? Getting that balance is what the net neutrality debate is about. And different people strike different balances. Some of what we've heard a lot in India is about banning a number of practices and calling for full mandatorily neutral internet. And I don't think that's necessarily a good idea. And that a lot of the debate is about the nuances, is about the finesse and the language that is actually used in regulation or law that eventually comes up. It's not just about the values that you hold, because as ISPs will tell you, they want to give you more content. As content providers will tell you, they want to do the same. As consumers will tell you, they want all of this. So at that level, there is no disagreement. Okay? It's only when you go down deeper into it that disagreements start emerging. So given that there are many regulators, many of traditional telecom services and of traditional ICT, I think a lot of the concerns that they traditionally deal with are largely the concerns of net neutrality. So the traditional goals, in a sense, are that of ensuring universal and affordable access, are that of enabling and promoting effective competition and innovation, protecting consumers against harm. There are state-related concerns, such as those around taxation and security. All of these still apply. I think with the internet and with net neutrality, there is one more that comes into the picture, which hasn't traditionally been there with telephony, for instance, with point-to-point telephony, which is that of what one may loosely term openness or diversity, depending on how exactly you look at it. This is, which sometimes, and sometimes wrongly, also gets described as the fundamental nature of the internet, of the end-to-end principle, etc., which really is when the concern really is that about ensuring that there is a diversity of content that is able and uses that the internet can be put to, and that one doesn't allow the gatekeepers, the ISPs, to have too much control over the content that rides over their networks. So that isn't something that regulators, that telecom regulators, have normally had to deal with. Since in the world of telephony, it's point-to-point connections, and the only interconnection issues that they've dealt with are interconnection between like networks, not interconnection between unlike networks, between the content providers and their internet networks and their internet providers, etc., and traditional telephone and telecom and cable networks. That isn't something that they have had to deal with so far. So, but one can see net neutrality regulation is affected by each of these goals, right? And one may view with regulation around zero rating, that I'll come to in a moment, that the issue of access is pitted against the issue of openness and diversity. So there can, and there often is, competition between these values, but these are the values that the regulators are trying to promote. I'll briefly also discuss the trajectory taken by the regulatory debate in India, because Christopher, you also spoke about that, and I think that is interesting in India. It starts off, I think, from a very different position from other countries. The first salvo in this battle, really, was fired not by consumer groups off the shoulders of the telecom regulator, as it often is in countries, but the first salvo in India was fired by telecom companies off the shoulder of the regulators. of the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India issued a report earlier this year in February, which was not about net neutrality, or it was really a report on OTT regulation. And OTT, again, is such a telecom term, because what we know as OTT is just the internet, and anything that travels on the internet, right? So the main concerns, the report was extraordinarily one-sided, which is a great concern to me, because I've traditionally viewed the TRAI as a neutral body, but this particular report was extraordinarily one-sided, much to my dismay. And the main picture that it provided, that it painted, was that of content providers free riding on ISP networks, of telecom companies, which are the main ISPs in India. The cable industry eventually lost out to telecom companies, even though both were in equal competition in the early days of internet provisioning in India in the late 90s, but telecom companies eventually won. So that of telecom companies losing revenue thanks to competing applications such as WhatsApp, which is incredibly popular in India. And also speaking a little bit about differential regulation and regulatory arbitrage. Now, of these, I think the most valid concern is that of regulatory arbitrage when you have OTT companies providing the same kind of services as traditional telephony companies when it comes to SMSs and voice, for instance. And in those areas, we have to reduce the regulatory arbitrage. But that reduction doesn't necessarily mean increasing the amount of regulation that we have on internet companies, right? What I prefer is reducing the amount of regulation that we have on telecom companies providing these kinds of services, reducing some of the bad regulation that we have in that area, rather than introducing new bad regulation for the internet. But at any rate, the report was on OTT regulation. It contained what I believe are just plain falsities. It painted a picture that isn't supported by statistics on revenues, etc., which researchers dug up and said, wait a second, you're talking about falling revenues? This doesn't show falling revenues. In fact, your revenues from data services, including WhatsApp, which is a primary driver of these services, is actually much more than what you're losing, supposedly losing in terms of SMSs, right? And so you aren't, at least the larger ISPs aren't losing money, larger mobile companies are not losing money thanks to all of this. And the things that the report didn't adequately address were, for instance, another early point in the discussion on net neutrality, which is relatively new, which doesn't go back as far as the discussion in the US. For instance, I remember as a law student reading the Wu versus You debates, but the public really started discussing this issue only in December of last year, when there was a proposal by Airtel, India's largest telecom company, to block WhatsApp and to force its consumers, I beg your pardon, to actually buy special packs if they wanted access to WhatsApp, and to charge access to WhatsApp at a rate closer to what they charge for SMSs. And as all of you know, being telecom experts, SMSs essentially cost next to zero to transport. And so there's a lot of money that telecom companies make off that, a large profit per message that they make from that. And they wanted to safeguard that. Yet the report doesn't really address that as a concern, talks instead only from one perspective of losing revenue, of decreasing revenue from SMSs. Very few of the submissions to the TRAI report spoke about things like specialized services. The submission by the Center for Internet and Society, which I represent, and which we jointly authored with the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, was one of the few submissions that I could see that actually spoke about this. And well, the majority, I have to admit, I haven't read the majority of the responses because there were more than 1 million responses, thanks to a campaign called the Save the Internet campaign. It's the largest amount of responses that a regulator has ever received in India, but looking at a few of the less generic messages that the Save the Internet campaign generated, and of the think tanks, of the ISPs, etc., and the industry bodies, and what they submitted, there were very few that even addressed specialized services. Traffic management rules and what those should be like got very little attention, despite that being a large part of the net neutrality debate, because that, for most, is either compressed into we need reasonable traffic management, or no, don't restrict what we can do with traffic management. But there's not much discussion as to what does reasonable traffic management look like, what does that mean, etc. So, things like paid peering and those set of issues and interconnection issues have received almost no attention. Very few people know what that is, despite the fact that a large part of the Indian debate has borrowed from the American debate around this issue, and so that I find a bit surprising. So Netflix is mentioned despite Netflix not being there in India, yet the details of the Netflix conflict has not really been appreciated. And while I'm speaking about paid peering, and I'll take 2 more minutes on this, there is some fascinating work by academics in Columbia and in the National University of Singapore who have worked on network economics and have developed very interesting analysis of peering arrangements, looking at the internet not as a simple double-sided market, which much of the analysis has tended to, but looking at it as a convex cooperative game, and looking for the Shapley value analysis, trying to find what stability in terms of payment relationships between the content providers, the content ISPs, the content providers, the content ISPs, the transit ISPs, and the eyeball ISPs, what this value chain really, what a stable point in this value chain really looks like, in this game really looks like. And that I personally think is some of the best analysis of this issue. Now coming to the last point, which is that of zero rating. Now, having started off by discussion of things such as free riding and to a limited extent blocking of WhatsApp, the largest part of the debate in India right now is about zero rating. And the 2 largest examples of that are internet.org, which has recently been renamed to Free Basics, and a scheme called Airtel Zero. Now, Airtel Zero, I think, is the more interesting example and poses the tougher challenges personally. I'm happy to speak later at the during the question answer session about Free Basics and why I think they're actually not just one type of zero rating that you can just regulate, but there are actually at least 4 or 5 different types of zero rating that have different kind of impact that we must regulate differently. But keeping that point aside, Airtel Zero is the creation of a marketplace at the level of the ISP. So it's what one expects to see at a different location, that of bulk data purchase. Okay, so they're creating a bulk data marketplace, but not at the level, not further away, not at the content provider level, which is normally where that happens, but at the level of the ISP. And that has a great number of implications and does tend to give the ISP a very strong role as a gatekeeper, and so tends to threaten the openness of the internet to a far greater extent than something like free basics, where the same kind of incentive structure does not exist. So I'm happy to speak later about this, but thank you so far.
Thank you, Pranesh. I'm sure there'll be plenty of time to go into a zero rating in more detail. Let's now hear the perspective of a vendor that is working with operators, and I'd be interested to know from Elizabeth how have the FCC rules in particular affected their business and their operations. Elizabeth is the Director for Public Affairs for Alcatel-Lucent. And a fun fact about her, she's not a very patient person, so she reads books and reports starting from the back, which is in fact a good thing to do, particularly for some reports. So over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I know it's very late and it's been a long day. So I joined Alcatel-Lucent 10 months ago. I'm fairly new to the industry, so I look forward to meeting everyone today and tomorrow. So Alcatel-Lucent, we are very focused on creating networks, and the networks are not just for the operators, they're ultimately for the people. Our vision is to make global communications more innovative, more sustainable, and more accessible through trusted networks. So at the base of all the economic development debate, I think it's all about the network. So if you don't invest in the network, then you're not going to have a happy consumer. So from the United States perspective with net neutrality, I think there are two things that are impacting the industry and ultimately the consumer. So number one, I believe that the current open internet order has created a lot of uncertainty and a lot of risk in the market. So when you have a lot of risk, there's a lack of investment, and there's a lack of investment in infrastructure. So ultimately, this is going to hurt the consumers, and this is something that we worry about. Let's see, there was a study recently by Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, and they noted that there's a potential to lose half of $43 billion in investment in infrastructure if we don't have an environment that is more certain in the United States. So Dr. Shapiro and Kevin Hassett, who conducted the investment, I don't want to throw too many statistics at you, but they have estimated that the future total wireline and wireless investments will decline by 12.8% and 20.8%. Again, if we don't have strong networks, innovative networks that can continue with the demand from consumers, we will ultimately not have happy consumers. Another statistic that was cited by a report by Dr. Hal Singer says that in the first half of 2015 alone, after the net neutrality regulations came out, AT&T CapEx on the first half of 2015 was down by 29%. And the same was with Charters, and Cablevision decreased by 10%, Centrelink by 9%, and then Verizon by 4%. So, of course, I'm an economist. This is just one statistic, but it is a proof to see that investments have stopped, and we don't want that to happen. So other things that we need to consider is that generally investments in innovation and networks, even though the economy is stagnant, they always grow faster than the economy. And if we have these statistics coming up, then we know that there's something happening, right, where the industry is not trying to invest. Let's see. So the other thing that I wanted to bring up, and I'll try to keep my comments very short, is the environment is very, very uncertain, but why is that? We have regulations coming on the one hand, we have a major lawsuit coming up, right? And then you have Congress trying to enact legislation, and finally, in 2016, we're gonna have a new president. So that's a lot of uncertainty in the market, and it's just not good for investments. The other thing that I think is very interesting is that if we are thinking about the future, we're thinking about the Internet of Things, 2020 and beyond, how can we be reclassifying information services as a telecommunication service and then impose a law from 1934, right? So the Internet of Things is the future. Why are we going back in time in terms of regulation? So technology, innovation, it evolves faster than us, and I think it's very hard sometimes to keep up with that in terms of the regulation side. So even though the bright line rules of no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization are very clear for telecommunication companies, sometimes for everything that's Internet of Things, such as healthcare, you have sensitive health monitoring applications, public safety applications. When you have to redirect the traffic for those, then you have a big question mark. So I'm not sure how this is going to all keep up with it. And I will conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Our final speaker of the afternoon is Leong. He's assistant director in the IDA, which is the telecommunications regulator in Singapore, where he leads the department that reviews and develops internet policy, amongst other things. An interesting fact about Louis is that he has jumped off a plane 13 times, and once he landed on a tree. So I think that the question for you as a regulator that has had net neutrality rules for almost 5 years, and in fact you adopted them in record time. I think it was only in 6 months, if my memory doesn't fail me. What's your experience been to date, and do you think that you got this balance that we've been discussing between protecting and promoting consumer welfare and investment, if that is a contradiction? Have you got it right? Are there any insights or lessons you've learned that you would like to share?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to talk today. Just to clarify, I landed on the tree because I was trying to avoid some cows and cow dung on the fields itself. So yeah, and I would love to have GoPro then, but yeah, it's only. For the next 10 minutes, I'm trying to share some slides on how Singapore has imposed the net neutrality framework. But first off, I would like to provide some important market conditions and also a context of Singapore. Singapore has a very good broadband infrastructure. Currently, we have 5 to 6 ISPs offering fiber networks to Singaporeans. So as of now, the lowest broadband speed a subscriber can get in the market is 100 megabit per second. And for 1 gigabit per second fiber network, a user will generally need to pay around 27 USD. So we are not the lowest, but I think we are quite competitive in the landscape itself. So, but one thing about Singapore is that we are very small. We are a small resort. We are only 277 square miles. So I need to do some conversion for the US market. So square miles. And we have 5.5 million population. So currently, if I'm not wrong, our mobile market penetration is 180%. So that's a lot of people accessing the internet over the mobile network. And that's all for the market context. But that is important to know about it. So IDA adopt a 3-point approach towards net neutrality. First important point, which is also a very important one, which is a competitive landscape. So we need to build a competitive landscape where a lot of ISPs are competing. And this is important. For example, back in perhaps 2 to 3 years' time, back in 2012 or 2013 itself, some of the ISPs have indicated they will throttle P2P network. They mean they will reduce it, etc. But with more and more ISP entering the market itself, some of the ISPs say, hey, I want to differentiate myself. So I introduce plans that doesn't throttle P2P network. So consumers suddenly have a choice. And with competition, we believe that's the key element. Second key point of our framework, which is information transparency. If the ISP is throttling the network, they need to publish on their websites as well as their marketing material so that consumers can make the right decision that, okay, for $20 or $30, I'll subscribe to this service, but this comes with throttling. And if I pay another $10 more, I'll get an untethered or unthrottled network. So first, we have competition. Second, information transparency. And finally, the third point, which is where regulator comes in and says that beside that, we'll need to have QoS, quality of service. So we post certain quality of service on the ISPs, network availability, what is your bandwidth utilization limits, etc. So all this is to safeguard the consumer interest, which they are unable to do so. So we're trying to, through this framework, we're trying to balance both the consumer interest as well as the industry on how ISP can be more flexible in the market to introduce their services. So we have introduced this in 2012 after consultation with major players, with the ISPs locally, as well as we received some feedbacks from other international ISPs, and also Google, etc. That was in 2011. In 2012, we came out with the net neutrality framework. But what we want to highlight importantly is that market condition makes a very big difference. In certain countries where they have much more competitive, much more ISPs in their market, perhaps Hong Kong, I would like to say so, they rely solely on competition to address the issue, not much of a net neutrality rulings. In USA, I think in 2014, FCC released a broadband report to mention that around 58% of the residents in USA have only access to 1 or 0 ISP that provide broadband service. Now, can you imagine that if FCC does not come up with certain regulation, can the consumer jump ship and say that since this ISP is imposing certain conditions that I don't like, can I change my ISPs? They can't. So, but I'm not defending anyone. I'm just saying that every regulator face different conditions, the market conditions, the market structure, how many ISPs, consumer demand, etc. It's not I don't think there is a single regulator, standardized regulatory framework of net neutrality that can be imposed universally across all the nations around the world. So that's an important thing to think of. And finally, on the question on what can we do better, I think as a philosophy of doing public policy in Singapore, we always look outside. That's why we are always monitoring, not just in what is happening within Singapore itself, but also looking at why is FCC doing all this in net neutrality policy, what is EU, what is the consideration. For example, EU paid prioritization and specialized lane. Very interesting dynamic down there. Actually, we are still trying to find out how exactly it will work in practice. That's one thing. Why is India and Indonesia so focusing on 0 rating? That's one thing. So in Singapore currently, all this 0 rating, paid prioritization, technically, the ISP can go and do it, because if the ISP decided to do paid prioritization, and if the consumers are not happy, they can jump ship. But of course, as a regulator, we need to conduct regular reviews. And with all this development, we are definitely, that's why we are here, trying to understand what's the various development, as well as understanding how other regulators are reviewing this and looking into all these issues. And I guess that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louis, for those very interesting remarks. And thank you, all of you, for keeping to time. We have almost 45 minutes for discussion. So I'll first give the panelists the opportunity to respond to one another. If there's anything that you would like to add or say, and then open up to the floor.
I have some questions.
Okay, so Christopher, please.
So I think that it's a wonderful thing when Pranesh and I are agreeing on things. You know, I think that this is a very, I mean, one of the spirits that really should animate this is that but all the participants in this industry are channel partners. They have cooperative interests, and they should maximize the value of the network. That they share. They're also going to fight like crazy over how to divide up the wealth generated by that after that happens. Now, an economist would say the cooperative interest should dominate the adversarial interest, because you're going to do that every time. You should come to some long-term accommodation of how that's going to be divided. And then once you settle that, you can focus on really building a great, great ecosystem. Unfortunately, what happens in this industry, the short-term dynamics of trying to claim a little extra percentage often overwhelm what should be a cooperative effort. This other thing that I really like about what Pranesh is saying is focusing on what the real policy problems are is really important here. So one of the interesting questions to me is, if the central problem that we're talking about in the IGF is connecting the next billion, or actually connecting the next 4 billion. And in fact, the US State Department is doing an initiative on that point. On some level, network neutrality is about the quality of the connection you have. For the people who don't have a connection, it is a secondary consideration. The primary one is how are we going to get those people connected? And in a sense, that is as important a policy issue in reframing it as anything. Even in developing countries, you normally look at a chain of production, and you want each of the steps to be competitive. And as a policy matter, you find the one that's the most concentrated and the most protected by entry barriers, and you direct policy at fixing that. Oddly enough, much of the debate is framed by promoting applications and content. That is the most competitive and the least part of the network and the industry and least protected by entry barriers. So in a way, framing it as protecting them, I think gets the policy question backwards. Our real challenge is upgrading networks, building new networks so they don't exist and updating to accommodate video. And there we have an interesting problem, which is a private company that faces that decision is going to say, how much revenue is this going to generate and how much is it going to cost? If you're in a country that can finance this with public revenues, you don't have this challenge. But for the most countries that are relying on private companies to do that, they have to make that comparison. And to some extent, in the US, that means monetizing video. That has to be part of the equation if we expect private companies to invest in new bandwidth. And finding ways to lower their costs makes it easier for them to get into more neighborhoods. Because if we make both those things harder, simply put, the break-even number of customers they need to make it will go up, and they'll build in fewer places, and they won't reach. And so what I think Pranesh is helpfully pointing at is there is a right way to think about this that benefits consumers by focusing on the problems. And it's very easy to get sucked into companies who are saying, oh, we have this problem, we have to fix it. So an interesting thing that's happening in Spain, Spain initially said that they were going to deregulate all higher speed broadband services over 30 meg to continue to regulate the slower speeds, but really to encourage investment in the upper speeds. And what we saw are announcements not just by the incumbent, but by competitors of build-outs, not just in the largest cities, but in medium-sized cities, and even smaller cities. Then the regulators said, they're going to consider taking that back and subjecting 30 meg services to conventional unbundling. And at that point, all the providers began to cancel their build-out plans because they realized that, that the potential revenue they were looking at may be in jeopardy. And there are other examples I can give that would be very interesting, but the funny thing is, we have to pay attention to the overall health of the ecosystem and an equitable sharing of the financing of what is going to be a huge multi-billion-dollar investment that's going to benefit our consumers if we can create the right situation to let it happen.
I'll make one very quick point on what Professor Yu said, and then I have a couple of questions for Louis. One is on something like paid peering, right? As he pointed out that there, on the internet, there is not just one way of reaching a consumer, that there are multiple ways of reaching consumer. Except that the problem ends up being that regardless of which transit provider or which kind of intermediary a company like Netflix uses, regardless, and they're always trying to cut their own costs, regardless, it's always going to be a problem in terms of the negotiation between them or their intermediaries and the gatekeepers, the eyeball ISPs. Because you can't, in a situation where you have 58% of the population having only one ISP provider, like internet service provider, you don't have multiple routes to reach that person. So those gatekeepers end up being able to extract far more value than what they might otherwise be providing to the network. And I realized that we had an entire panel on net neutrality but didn't provide a definition. So this is what my working definition is, that net neutrality is the principle that we should regulate gatekeepers to ensure they do not use their power as gatekeepers to unjustly discriminate between similarly situated persons, content, or traffic. And there are two important variables here. One, that it's not just discrimination, it's about unjust discrimination. So not all discrimination is harmful, is bad, first. And the second is that it's not just between any two entities that they have to be similarly situated entities or similarly situated content. So as an example, charging differently for VoIP and for other kinds of traffic by an ISP is not legitimate, because in this instance they're similarly situated. You can't really tell whether it's that one is VoIP, that the other is other kind of content, and that from a network perspective does not make much of a difference. But for other kinds of things, you might want to, for instance, in terms of prioritization, they are not necessarily the same. One has to be delivered at a heightened priority to another. So for different kinds of things, even VoIP and other kinds of traffic may, in some situations, be similarly situated. In other situations, may be differently situated. So that's something I just want to point out. And I had a couple of questions regarding the solution set, right, that Singapore has adopted. Now, transparency, there's a paper by, I'm forgetting, by some folks at Oxford who have pointed out that in the UK, that transparency doesn't really work because consumers don't really understand the differences between, non-throttling networks and throttling networks, and what, especially given the kinds of terms that these companies are using, given that there is no universal framework for this kind of reporting, etc. So how do you get around that problem? And the second is a report that Ofcom has commissioned that was recently published, which deals, I guess, both with the transparency issue and the QoS issue. That is, how do you know as a regulator whether the ISPs are actually disclosing what they ought to disclose, and whether they're actually following what your rules are, whether they're, for instance, throttling for one particular reason because it's P2P traffic, or whether the throttling is happening for some other reason that is legitimate in terms of reasonable network management. So these kinds of questions, it turns out, using existing technology, using existing methods, are very difficult to answer. And we don't have the necessary tool set, and regulators don't have the necessary tool set to actually do those kinds of network measurements to answer both the questions of whether certain kinds of network practices are happening, where they are happening, whether at the ISP level or somewhere upstream, and why they are happening, you can't actually answer all these questions well. And that's what the Ofcom Commission report essentially says. So given these two problems, how do you work around that?
Okay, I wouldn't say I have all the solutions or all the answers to your problem, but I'll try to perhaps shed some light, or you'll even appreciate Ofcom from helping out in this case. First thing first, let me avoid the two questions and go back to the net neutrality definition. There is no single definition. Tim Wu, your definition, FCC, EU, if you put it together, you have 4 different definitions. And if you include other scholars, yes, there will be others. But wait, there are common principles. Non-discriminatory, no blocking of legitimate contents, reasonable network management. There are some principles that are common. And I guess some of the regulators do it. So, for example, when ICC say no throttling, but there's always a very big but somehow down there. you are able to do network management. So does it mean that if P2P is congesting 90% of a network, can the ISP throttle it? Or in this case, network manage it? The answer might be a yes or might be a no, depending on the regulator. But the whole thing is that everyone define their issues differently and consider it based on market conditions. For example, 90% of a 1 gig plan is being used for broadband, P2P. You still have 100 meg, and you can still surf YouTube. 90% block of 1 megabit, you're left with nothing, 100 kilobit. Can you do any YouTube surfing? A bit challenging, possible, but you have bad quality of viewing of YouTube, and users are typically not so very happy. Now, how do we actually highlight? So we did ask the ISPs to publish all their network managements online on their publicity material as well. I agree with you. Not all consumers are aware of how to interpret all this data itself. But in Singapore, we do work with some of the newspaper, and they write often frequent articles on, okay, this ISP, ranking of ISP, why are they better? How do you read all these data points? And they always do price comparison. Singapore residents are very, very, very price sensitive. But at the same time, they also go to forums and check with their relatives, how is this particular ISP doing itself? So all this information will flow through to the consumers. But of course, I must highlight and stress that not all 100% of all residents in Singapore will know how to read all this data. But I guess we are doing what we can as a regulator to spread all this information, how to interpret them through mass public materials. Number 2 is how do you know that the ISP have disclosed? So if the ISP lies to us, actually that could be a legal repercussion on them. We can take regulatory action against them. That's one thing. And number 2, public feedback. If they claim that they are not blocking any second website, but most consumers are facing some issues, they can send evidence to us and we can check it. Number 3, there should be a lot of ISP and telcos down here who can maybe also share some information. But if I'm not wrong, you can technically measure whether a particular ISP is blocking the website, etc. Using SAMNO, if I'm not wrong, etc. Correct? So there are measures, technical measures in place that you can actually check on it, as well as rely on public feedback, which is very important. So most of the Singaporeans are online. So they can, and they are ready to send complaints to you as a regulator. Trust me, we receive a lot of complaints sometimes, that how the quality of service has gone down, etc. Then we have to make the judgment based on whatever we have set on the QoS and see whether they have fulfilled them themselves. So I guess, as a regulator, we will come up with a lot of recommendations, proposals on how to improve the consumer interest as well as trying to balance the businesses, because we also know that they need the incentive to build and improve their network, etc. So the whole thing is about striking a balance. It's not easy. Sometimes you tilt a bit here, but you need to tilt back a bit. So it's a seesaw. And it's not being easy when your newspaper are saying, look, FCC has introduced this net neutrality ruling. Let's follow them. But they forgot to check that we have introduced them in 2012. That's a funny thing. So we are trying to balance at all times. It's not always going to be easy for the regulators, but that's where the consumers, the business must actively give their voice during consultation and not hide away. After the regulators give their inputs, decided something, then you start banging the table, a bit too late. So next time, please give your inputs earlier.
And I'll make a comment here, and I agree with that statement. We've made tons of comments, and a lot of the comments we made, the FCC took them, so that's great. But sometimes there's a lot of exceptions, and there's a lot of blanket regulations, and then you have unintended consequences. So again, back to my Internet of Things comment, I'm really fixated on this because you have specialized services, and then you have facilities such as voice over IP and heart monitors that don't fall outside of this definition. So, I mean, because things are not so clear, you might trump innovation, and that's probably the issue that I see coming from industry.
Can I open it up to the floor? I'd like either questions or comments. So we have one at the back, one at the front.
Hi.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. Nicole Turner-Lee at the Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council. We changed our name. So I have this question on zero ratings. I find the conversation to be pretty fascinating, particularly in light of the Open Internet Order. And I looked up the Airtel example as you were talking, because one could argue that zero ratings like Facebook Basics is really a driver towards broadband adoption and closing the digital divide, while at the same time, under the current order, it could also be argued that it's a form of prioritization and sort of, again, gatekeeping the network by providing content that may or may not be relevant to people if you look at it from a sociological perspective, or, you know, it goes completely against the Open Internet Order. I'm real curious because, you know, just really shortly, here in the States in particular, and I've seen the examples in India, there are some public benefit, public interest uses for zero ratings. And I'm just curious with regards to, because I know there's just been talk that it's not necessarily a specialized service. It could be. There's a little clause that said the FCC would do a, you know, case by case. Just would love your opinion. Are there particular public interest applications of zero rating programs that could help, particularly when you're trying to close the digital divide, offset this adoption and digital divide issue that limits people's ability to get online, to do these other meaningful applications that are outside of Netflix? So just really curious about that.
Great
and
question.
Sorry to be so long-winded, but I was trying to process.
Who wants to go first?
The king of zero rating.
I'd be happy to answer that. So I'm going to provide a short form of the answer. There's a paper, a draft paper that I've published on the CIS website, which in section 3.3.3.2 talks about what kinds of zero rating are good. And so you might be interested in looking that up for a more detailed answer. But in short, the kinds of zero rating which are content or source destination agnostic are good. And zero rating comes in many different forms. And there are some which are zero priced, zero rating, which are agnostic to content. There's an example that I don't know if you've heard of this company, the service called Gigato, which is quite innovative, which allows you to use a particular service that they're partnered with by paying money to use that service. So say Uber, okay, all the data that you use over Uber, you're paying money to access that site, but then Uber subsidizes the cost, okay, pays money to Gigato, and Gigato buys a data pack and some data for you and gives you that data, which you can use to access any internet website or any of the internet for email, for anything. Okay, so that's, for instance, a far better model of zero rating than free basics. But I personally don't think that free basics is harmful enough to be banned, which is the call, and this is where I depart from most consumer groups in India, where most people are calling for a ban on all zero rating. Mm-hmm. And then Airtel Zero, with both free basics and Airtel Zero, the problem is we need some amount of regulation to ensure that they don't become exclusionary contracts. If only people on Reliance can have access to free basics, then that is a problem. Okay? If, on the other hand, free basics, and there were competing services to free basics, if multi-homing was possible by a person having a single device actually using many different kinds of zero rating services, okay, then that kind of zero rating poses far fewer competition-related concerns, because most of this, for me, boils down to concerns about competition and about openness and diversity. So, and we have to ensure, we can't allow, for instance, for predatory pricing and say that that's beneficial for consumers. And we have to avoid that situation importantly. there are some kinds of zero rating that we haven't even touched, that no one even really talks about. For instance, zero rating of locally peered content, which for an ISP is very easy to transport, costs very little for them to transport. Okay, and if they try and say, okay, fine, since this is costing us next to nothing, we're happy passing on the benefits to the customers. Well, there is an ISP in India that was doing that and now has stopped doing it in response to a poll that they conducted. Okay, but that is a kind of zero rating that we aren't really talking about, that we aren't really considering, where the content provider isn't providing any money to an ISP to do that zero rating. And we also have to think about when they are paying money, whether we should allow for that at all, for the ISP to become a double-sided market. That could be quite harmful, but perhaps if we have a double-sided market where we have FRAND kind of rules, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory kind of rules, ensuring that it gets properly recognized as an open platform and allows for all sides to compete equally, then perhaps it might not be as harmful. I'm not really as sure, but I'm just saying that zero rating is potentially greatly problematic, but it's an open question and the harms can be mitigated in some ways.
So one of the interesting things that we're learning about zero rating programs, and it occurs to me, does everyone know what a zero rating program is? Okay. No, okay. So a zero rating program, normally you pay for your data service on your phone. There are companies, Facebook Zero, now Free Basics, Wikipedia Zero, will give you a cheap feature phone with their app positioned as the front page. All the traffic you use on that page does not count against your data cap. So effectively, it makes your traffic to that location cheaper. It also, because it makes traffic to one company cheaper, is potentially discriminatory. And the question is, does it favor one provider? In some cases, that provider also is paying money to finance the build-out of the network and possibly to finance the phone. So what is interesting is, first, people became very concerned that people would think Facebook in Facebook Zero, now Free Basics, was the internet and get stuck there. Statistically, that turns out not to be true. Apparently, Facebook Zero users surf 80 to 90% of their data traffic outside of Facebook, and 50 to 60% of them upgrade to a full feature phone. Second, the thing that's interesting is that you have to remember the vast majority, not the majority, a huge amount of the revenue in this industry is coming through advertising. Not unlike the other worlds where it was direct payments to the network provider. And in a sense, one of the things that zero rating allows the providers to do, the people who receive the advertising funding to do, is to take some of that revenue and put it back in. So we saw this in broadcast television. The advertising-supported networks would pay local television stations to be part of their network. They would subsidize their connectivity, not because they were giving money away. It was in their selfish best interest. They would make all that money back in advertising and then some. So what we start to see, the real inside of two-sided markets, is that the money can flow either way, and that it is often beneficial for an advertising-supported industry to subsidize connectivity up to a point because it's good business for them to do that. And one of the things zero rating systems can allow us to do is to tap into that. The other thing I want to go back is to something that the first keynote, Mr. Ramos emphasized, is that we have in adoption of broadband not just a supply side problem. It's not just getting networks everywhere and keeping it cheap. We have a demand side problem. He said that 70% of the, I can't remember, Brazil and the other one was India, one was 70 and one was 57%, said that the problem is they don't see the value in adopting the internet. There was a study in the US among people, the 30% of the households that haven't adopted, done by 2 staffers from the Federal Communications Commission and 2 people who work for an outfit called Connected Nation that wires rural networks in Kentucky and other places. They surveyed non-adopters in the US. 2/3 would not take broadband even if it were free. So I will tell you, for those people, it is not price. What they say is they don't see the value. 0 rating, giving them Facebook to a family and says, you know what, you can contact your children in the US your grandchildren in the US for free for this. They don't understand the internet in the abstract. They get that. And one of the things that the challenges facing regulators is the traditional approach of supply-side regulation, thinking about investments and pricing. Even if you succeed with 100% build-out on dirt-cheap prices, this data is telling you, your country still won't see the benefits. Because there has to be a broadband plan that addresses the demand side through e-government services, e-health, and other things that goes along with it. Because there's a bunch of people that won't adopt anyway. And that's one of the things 0 rating can do by positioning things that consumers want on the front page so they get it and become one of those 60% that then upgrade to the full internet.
Yeah, so I'll make a comment too about this. I think that was an excellent question, having an application for a social good and have it, 0 rating for the consumer. So to answer your question, I don't know what apps are out there for that. However, we do support 0 rating, and we commented on this during the FCC filing, and we do have a pilot project for M-Healthcare in Senegal, a very successful model, and another model in Mexico, and it never occurred to me that this is an opportunity to promote social good. So I just loved your comment. Thank you for the idea.
I think we